A man in a torn rain jacket stood outside Fort Bragg's Memorial Hall, watching through a foggy window as soldiers in dress uniforms shook hands with generals. Rain dripped off the bill of his faded cap and pooled around boots held together with duct tape. Inside, chandeliers lit up rows of polished brass and pressed creases. Outside, he stood in the mud. A young MP noticed him and walked over. "Sir, you need to move along. This is a restricted ceremony." The man didn't argue. He just nodded and took one step back, but he didn't leave. He couldn't. Not today. If this story already moves you, comment "Honour" right now, because what happens next will shake you to your core. His name was Leonard Dane, and if you passed him on any street in Fayetteville, North Carolina, you wouldn't look twice. 69 years old, gaunt face weathered by decades of sun and cold, and nights spent under highway overpasses. His beard was streaked white and grey, untrimmed, and his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a nerve condition he'd carried since the late 60s. Leonard had been homeless for 11 years. Before that, he'd held a job at a lumber yard until his back gave out. Before that, he'd driven trucks for a regional hauling company. And before all of it, before the jobs and the poverty and the slow slide into invisibility, Leonard Dane had been a United States Army Ranger who served 2 tours in Vietnam. But nobody knew that anymore. The medals were gone, pawned years ago for rent he still couldn't make. The discharge papers had been lost in a fire at a halfway house in 2014. The men who had served beside him were either dead or scattered across VA hospitals. Leonard Dane existed now as a man without a provable past, a ghost standing in the rain outside a building full of people who would never believe his story, even if he told it. The ceremony inside was the annual Valor Recognition event, a tradition at Fort Bragg where the current command honoured both active duty soldiers and historical recipients of Distinguished Service Medals. This year, the theme was Unfinished Honour, a programme dedicated to locating veterans whose awards had been delayed, lost in bureaucratic tangles, or never properly presented due to the chaos of wartime paperwork. A researcher at the National Archives named Catherine Marsh had spent 3 years combing through after-action reports, unit diaries, and declassified mission files from Vietnam, and she had built a list of 17 names, soldiers who had earned commendations that were approved but never delivered. 14 of those men were confirmed deceased. 2 had been located and were seated inside the hall in wheelchairs, surrounded by family. The 17th name on Catherine's list had proven impossible to trace. No current address, no living relatives found, no response to notices published in veterans magazines. The file simply said, Sergeant First Class Leonard R. Dane, MOS 11B, 75th Infantry Regiment, Ranger, recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, approved January 1969, never presented. Catherine had flagged it with a red tag and a single handwritten note. Believed alive, cannot confirm location. Inside the hall, Colonel James Beckett stood at the podium adjusting his microphone. Beckett was a tall man, squared jaw, silver at the temples, 31 years in the army and counting. He had overseen this ceremony for the past 4 years, and each time it moved him, but tonight felt different. Catherine had briefed him on the 17 files, and the one marked with the red tag had kept him up the night before. He'd read the after-action report 3 times. What Sergeant Dane had done on the night of March 14, 1968, near the village of Dak To in the Central Highlands, was not the kind of thing you forgot. It was the kind of thing that got carved into stone. Beckett cleared his throat, welcomed the audience of 300, and began with the first presentation. A young staff sergeant received a Bronze Star for actions in Afghanistan. The applause was warm, genuine. A retired master sergeant, 84 years old, was wheeled to the front to finally receive an Army Commendation Medal, 50 years overdue. His granddaughter wept openly. The audience rose. It was a night built for emotion, and it delivered. Outside, Leonard watched it all through the window. He had heard about the ceremony from another homeless veteran at the shelter on Hay Street, a man named Donald, who still got the VFW newsletter. Donald had mentioned it casually over a shared cup of coffee. They're doing some kind of medal thing at Bragg. Honouring old guys from Vietnam. Leonard hadn't said anything. He just nodded and sipped his coffee. But something stirred in him that night. Something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope. Something older and heavier than hope. A need to be near it, even if he couldn't be part of it. So he'd walked the 4 miles from the shelter to the base, talked his way past the first gate by telling the guard he was visiting a friend, and then made his way on foot through the rain to Memorial Hall. He hadn't planned to go inside. He knew how he looked. He knew what would happen. He just wanted to stand close enough to hear the words, to remember what it felt like when those words meant something, when they meant everything. The MP who had told him to move along was a young specialist named Rivera. 23 years old, 2 years in the service, assigned to base security. Rivera watched the old man from 20 feet away and felt a knot of irritation. Homeless civilians wandering onto base were a headache. Paperwork, reports, questions from the sergeant major about how they got through the gate. Rivera keyed his radio. Post 6, I've got a civilian outside Memorial Hall. Appears to be homeless, requesting guidance. The radio crackled back. Escort him to the main gate. Get his information for the log. Rivera walked back toward Leonard. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. You can't stay here. Leonard looked at him. His eyes were steady, calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from indifference, but from having seen so much that very little registers as a threat anymore. I understand, Leonard said quietly. I just wanted to hear the names. Rivera hesitated. Something about the way the old man said it gave him pause. What names? Leonard looked back through the window. The names of the men being honoured. I knew some of them. A long time ago. Rivera studied him for a moment. The rain was coming down harder now. You served? Leonard nodded once. 75th Rangers, 67 to 69. Rivera's expression shifted, just slightly. The 75th was legend. Every soldier on Bragg knew the lineage. Stay here, Rivera said. Don't move. I'll be right back. Rivera didn't go to the main gate. He went inside the hall and found Staff Sergeant Monroe, who was coordinating logistics near the back entrance. Rivera explained the situation in a low voice. Monroe frowned and asked if the man had any identification. Rivera said he didn't think so. Monroe told him to bring the man inside, quietly, through the service door, and seat him in the back row. If he's a ranger, he deserves to be in the room, Monroe said. We'll sort out the rest later. Rivera went back outside and found Leonard exactly where he'd left him, standing in the rain, watching through the glass. Come with me, Rivera said. We're bringing you inside. Leonard blinked. For the first time, his composure cracked, just barely. His lip pressed tight and his chin dipped. He followed Rivera without a word. They entered through a side corridor, and Rivera guided him to a chair in the last row near the wall. A few heads turned. A woman in the row ahead glanced at Leonard's wet, torn jacket and shifted slightly in her seat. Leonard sat perfectly still, hands on his knees, back straight. Old habits. The posture of a man who had once stood at attention before generals and never fully forgot how. Colonel Beckett was now midway through the programme. He had just finished presenting a posthumous Silver Star to the family of a helicopter pilot killed in 1971, when Catherine Marsh approached the podium and handed him a folded note. Beckett read it, then read it again. He looked up and scanned the room. Catherine whispered something in his ear. Beckett's jaw tightened. He set the note down and returned to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to read the next citation. This one is from a declassified after-action report dated March 15, 1968, filed by Captain William Herrera, commanding officer of a long-range reconnaissance patrol operating near Dak To in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. The room went still. Beckett's voice dropped into the register of a man reading something sacred. On the night of March 14, 1968, Sergeant First Class Leonard R. Dane, acting as patrol leader for a 6-man ranger team, was conducting a reconnaissance mission in enemy-controlled territory when the team was ambushed by an estimated 40 North Vietnamese regulars. Sergeant Dane was struck by shrapnel in the left shoulder and right leg within the first 90 seconds of contact. Despite his wounds, Sergeant Dane organised a defensive perimeter directed suppressive fire, and personally carried 2 critically injured team members to a covered position over a distance of approximately 120 meters under continuous enemy fire. Beckett paused. The hall was silent. Sergeant Dane then returned to the point of contact alone to retrieve classified communications equipment and destroy documents that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. During this action, he engaged and neutralized multiple enemy combatants at close range. He held the position for over 40 minutes until extraction helicopters arrived, at which point he refused evacuation until all surviving team members had been loaded. Sergeant Dane's actions that night saved the lives of 4 men and preserved critical intelligence assets. He was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. The award was approved in January of 1969. It was never presented. Every person in that hall felt the weight of the last sentence. 300 people sat in absolute stillness. Beckett looked up from the citation and spoke directly to the room. "We have spent 3 years searching for Sergeant Dane. The National Archives, the VA, veterans organisations across the country. We were unable to locate him." Beckett paused and his voice thickened. 10 minutes ago, I was informed that a man matching Sergeant Dane's description was found standing outside this building, in the rain, watching this ceremony through a window. The silence broke into a wave of murmurs, gasps, the sound of chairs shifting as people turned toward the back of the room. Beckett's eyes found the last row. "Sergeant Dane," he said, and his voice carried the full authority of 31 years in uniform. "Would you please stand?" Leonard didn't move at first. His hands were still on his knees, his eyes were fixed forward, and his chest rose and fell with the slow, controlled breathing of a man holding himself together by force of will. Then, slowly, Leonard Dane stood. His torn jacket dripped rainwater onto the polished floor. His boots left muddy prints on the carpet. He stood the way he had been taught to stand 55 years ago, shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward. The room erupted. Not in applause, not yet. First came the silence of recognition, that breathless half-second when 300 people understood what they were witnessing. Then, a retired general in the second row stood. Then a young lieutenant. Then a row of NCOs. Then the entire hall, every single person, rose to their feet. The applause began like thunder rolling in from a distance, and built until it filled the room and shook the windows that Leonard had been standing outside of just minutes before. Colonel Beckett stepped down from the podium and walked the full length of the centre aisle. In his hand, he carried a dark blue case. He stopped in front of Leonard and opened it. Inside, on a bed of white satin, lay the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valour in the United States Army. Beckett's eyes were red. "Sergeant Dane, on behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Army, it is my profound honour to present you with the award you earned 55 years ago. I am sorry it took us this long to find you." Leonard looked down at the medal. His hand came up, trembling, and his fingers touched the edge of the case. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I didn't come here for this. I just wanted to hear the names." Beckett nodded. "Your name was always on the list, Sergeant. It just took us too long to read it." The ceremony did not continue normally after that. It couldn't. What followed was something no one in that room had planned for, but everyone seemed to understand instinctively. Soldiers lined up to shake Leonard's hand. Young privates who hadn't been born when Leonard was carrying wounded men through jungle darkness stood before him and saluted. The retired general, a man named Harding who had served in Vietnam himself, gripped Leonard's hand with both of his and didn't let go for a long time. Catherine Marsh, the researcher who had spent months chasing a ghost through archived paperwork, stood off to the side with tears running down her face. She had found him. Not through databases or records or published notices. He had found his own way back. Rivera, the young MP who had almost escorted Leonard off the base, stood near the door with his arms folded tight across his chest, blinking hard and saying nothing. Staff Sergeant Munro quietly arranged for dry clothes from the base supply. Someone brought coffee. Someone else made a phone call to the local VA office. Within an hour, a caseworker was on the way. The machinery of recognition, so slow to start, was now moving fast. In the weeks that followed, Leonard Dane's life changed in ways he had stopped believing were possible. The VA expedited his benefits claim. A veterans' housing organisation in Fayetteville provided him with a small apartment, furnished, near the base. The 4 men whose lives he had saved in 1968, 2 of them still living, were contacted. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Paul Vigil, flew from Arizona to North Carolina to see Leonard in person. They sat together in Leonard's new apartment and said very little. They didn't need to. Paul brought a photograph from 1968, 6 young men in tiger-stripe fatigues standing in front of a helicopter. Leonard held it for a long time. "I remember every one of them," he said. Colonel Beckett personally checked in on Leonard twice in the following month. The ceremony footage, recorded by a base media team, was shared internally and eventually made its way to a local news station. The story ran for 3 nights. Letters arrived at the base addressed simply to the ranger from the ceremony. Rivera, the young MP, visited Leonard on his own time. He brought groceries. He didn't say much, but he kept coming back, every week, without being asked. Leonard Dane did not become famous. He did not write a book or go on talk shows. He lived quietly in his apartment, fed a stray cat that appeared on his doorstep in November, and walked to the VFW hall on Wednesday evenings, where he sat with other veterans and drank coffee and sometimes, when someone asked, told stories about the men he had served with. He never talked about what he had done. He talked about them, what they were like, what made them laugh, how they carried themselves under pressure. The Distinguished Service Cross sat in its case on a shelf in his bedroom, next to the photograph Paul Vigil had brought him. Sometimes at night, Leonard stood at his window and looked out at the lights of Fort Bragg in the distance, and he thought about a young man standing in the rain outside a building full of strangers, and he thought about how close he had come to walking away, and he thought about a voice on a microphone, reading a name he had almost forgotten was his. The world is full of people like Leonard Dane, people whose worth is invisible, whose sacrifices are unrecorded, whose dignity survives in silence long after everyone else has stopped paying attention. The next time you see someone the world has overlooked, remember this. You might be looking at the bravest person you will ever meet. You just don't know it yet. If this story reminded you that respect costs nothing but means everything, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories the world forgot to honor. And if you know a veteran who deserves to be seen, share this video, because sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to look away.